am very proud to introduce my young friend over here, I've known for a quarter of a century. She, too, is homegrown. She graduated Pali High, went to UC Berkeley. Berkeley Law School used to be called Bolt. She's well known to us, I have to say. She's kind of like, for those of us in our generation, the girl that can't say no. Whenever you ask her to come, she comes. Thank you, Kate, always. Energy Wire, in a 2014 Trendsetters profile about Kate, titled the piece, "Steyer's Secret Weapon Emerges as Power in Climate Debate." Now, everybody in the room knows who Tom Steyer is, and next gen, I hope, right? Okay. Now Kate serves as the Vice Chair of Climate and Sustainable Urbanization at the Paulson Institute, where she provides overall strategy and coordination for the Institute's climate change, air quality, and sustainable urbanization programs, both in the US and in China. So I X'd out all her other accomplishments just to say, a colleague of Kate says, Kate has the background, the experience, the relationships, the credibility, the brains, and the strategic perspective. All of those things together make her a really good person to have in the room when you're talking about climate policy. And one other thing I really do want to plug. Remember Risky Business? Who remembers it? Raise your hand. She is the originator and the implementer of that. So welcome, Kate. We feel fortunate to have you in our room today.
Barbara forgot to mention that I'm also the college roommate of her daughter, Claire. So there's a reason I don't say no to anything that Barbara asked me to do. It's so nice to be here. I think that we have to take a moment to recognize that this is going to be the only room during this political campaign where the line, "I'm a big fan of taxes," gets a cheer. So, so Severin, don't try that anywhere else. That's it's great to be back with you guys. I think this is a really impressive organization, and like Severin, I'll say some things that you agree with and some things that you might not. But let me just say, Severin and I talked a bit before this, and he, as he said, is an economist and doesn't want to game the political situation. My whole job is to game the political situation. So I will be more about politics than about economics, although I am trained in regional economic development, so I have actually a joint degree in law and city planning from Berkeley, and married a Berkeley person, and we're very Berkeley now, so that's fantastic. My background is mostly, again, in economic development, and I've spent a lot of time doing that from a lot of different perspectives. Unlike many people in this movement, I didn't come up sort of through the environmental movement. I was a tenant organizer in San Francisco after college. I thought I was going to be a tenant lawyer. Went to Berkeley, became interested in the big economic systems leading to some of the issues I was working on, got more and more interested in economic development, economic transition, and how to do economic growth in a way that's actually sustainable, which is what led me to where I am now. So I think that's important background, just in that my work on this has really come from a lot of different perspectives and working with many different kinds of stakeholders, not just from the environmental side. One of the organizations I helped start and ran for the first 6 years of my career in this work was called the Apollo Alliance. Some of you may remember Apollo. And we brought labor, business, community, and environmental groups together around the idea of clean energy as a way to spur a new kind of economic thinking. So how do you simultaneously think about building a sustainable economy from a workforce and inclusion and equity perspective, and diversified economic perspective, and one that's also sustainable? It's funny at the time, just to Severin's point about how politics are constantly changing, the Apollo Alliance wasn't about climate change at all. We were actually about energy independence, because at the time we were importing all our natural gas, we were importing all our oil, we were trying to figure out a way to have homegrown energy, right? And so the whole thing was predicated on domestic sources, and then of course that all blew up when domestic sources became primarily natural gas and oil. So now, of course, climate, and it always has been, frankly, is the driving force behind most of these things. So I say all this just to say my background really is in coming to these issues and look from where people already are. What kind of economy does the city already have, and how can they build on those assets and think about growth? what kind of stakeholders are in the room and how do they come to these issues and think about climate. So that makes me a pragmatist, which I guess is a dirty word right now, but I'm going to claim it anyway. I am a pragmatist on politics and policy, having done this for, over 15 years and seeing a lot of change and a lot of growth. So climate change, I mean, the key challenge of climate change, and Severin said this really well, is that it's a global issue, ultimately. This is a global issue that demands ultimately global solutions. Severin said this better than I could have about California, great leadership in the news all the time, out there in front of climate, 1% of the emissions. Still incredibly important, and I'll talk about that. So a global problem with global solutions, but the impacts, as you all know, are extremely local. This is what makes this such a challenging problem to address. So we have this need for these global deals and diplomacy, and something that feels very remote to most people. Even those of you who were in Paris, I know it was incredibly inspiring this year. The rooms in which those words get hashed out are not accessible to most people. I mean, I don't even understand the diplomacy side of climate change. The impacts are very local, they're very sectoral, they're very regional. What happens to one city is different than what happens to another city. Their ability to react, to adapt, to be resilient, and to mitigate is different. And that makes this a challenging problem because it means that the policies, especially around energy and transportation, are all really local when the problem is really global. And just to illustrate that, for those who did read the Risky Business Project, one of the things we did in that report was to kind of underscore the climate risk as a local issue, to talk about it as a big global problem, but then to say, okay, what does this actually mean in counties and at specific tide gauge levels in the United States? And what you see is that the US, which is a big country, obviously, but completely different impacts across the United States, completely different reactions, completely different political situations as a result. In the Southwest, this is a heat conversation, right? And it becomes a conversation about labor productivity and the ability to do construction at night because you can't do it during the day, and obviously about water availability. In the East Coast, in Miami, it's a sea level rise conversation. It's about flooding. It's about complete changes to infrastructure and building. The Northwest, acidification of the ocean and the impact on the oyster industry and wildfire potential. In California, obviously, there's a drought implication among many others. In the Midwest and the Plains, it's about energy demand and energy costs. Every one of those things is very different and demands a different political situation. And energy in general, and Henry Waxman said this once at a conference I was at, and I really took it to heart. Energy politically has always been an extremely local issue. And so we're talking about translating this global problem into this local political context, and that's complicated. However, complicated as it is, there is one universal truth here, which is that we have to level the playing field across the globe. And that the best way to do that is a price on emissions. Everybody believes this. The price on carbon is the thing that sort of universally needs to happen in order to get that playing field to a place where the energy solutions can happen politically at the local level. Now, as Severin said, there's a lot of technical questions about that. How do you do it? What works, what doesn't work from an economic perspective. Let me talk a little bit about what the political context is of that. We are in a interesting current political situation. So let me just do a little. Interesting is one word. A little bit of sort of, you all know this, I'm sure, but sort of where we are. So we have a Congress which is not totally inactive. So I'll talk about Congress in a second, but because Congress has had such a hard time politically with climate issues and frankly with energy issues, because energy is such a regional issue and different states have such incredible investments in their own natural resources, that's who funds them, that's who gives them jobs, that's where their money comes from. It's not surprising that West Virginia has a hard time voting, to get rid of coal. It's not surprising. Because of all those political complexities and climate just having become so polarizing, we have a situation where President Obama has essentially decided to put that to the side and go full bore on the administrative actions. That's happening obviously both nationally and internationally. So in Paris, those of you who were there, that diplomacy is actually pretty elegant in that what Paris created was not a set of mandates, but a process, a system into which countries can make promises, which is very good, actually. I mean, it's a system that recognizes regional diversity. So Paris was good. Paris did, from my perspective, as much as it could have done. I think it was the best outcome possible, given our current political situation. That's maybe depressing, but I think, good, could have been worse. and that process is important. On the national level, obviously the Clean Power Plan, and let me just take a moment, because everyone is talking about this. Let me just take a moment to say the stay put onto the Clean Power Plan by the Supreme Court is not fatal to the Clean Power Plan. I actually think, and I will just do this as my soapbox thing, it is a mistake politically for us to react to the stay as if it's fatal. It's a mistake to react to the stay as if it was a huge, huge crisis. In fact, reacting that way convinces states that don't like the Clean Power Plan that we all think that the Clean Power Plan is doomed. And I think that's just bad. We should not do that. So just let me put out that plug. Obviously, there's a little more optimism about the fate of the Clean Power Plan now, which is odd to be optimistic because somebody died, but that's sort of where we are. So putting that aside, so the Clean Power Plan, I will say, also somewhat elegant in that it recognizes different states have different energy plans, different resources, and different paths forward. And I think that's good. We have come a long way from the Waxman-Markey bill when everybody had to do the same thing. That's a political gain, I think. Behind the Clean Power Plan, there's this thing that you'll probably start hearing about if you haven't already, called Section 115 of the Clean Air Act, which is the law professor's favorite backup plan to the Clean Power Plan, which is all about the EPA's ability to regulate if other countries are regulating. The Paris Agreement gives people confidence that we can make an argument that other countries are regulating. 115 is untested. It's one of those things that law professor briefs have been written about, but it's interesting, and it's a good backup to when you're talking to people about the Clean Power Plan's ability to move forward. We have this other thing in the wings that could back it up. So if you really like to read legal professor documents, there's a very good law professor brief on Section 115 out there on the web that was done by NYU and Columbia and some other people. So these are the administrative actions, but they are limited. And let's just look at the fact of what just happened with the Clean Power Plan. We have administrative actions that are limited by people and personalities. That's the problem with doing things at the executive level. You need a president who actually cares and wants to push this forward. You need a Supreme Court made up of people who think it's okay that you did that the president took that power. You need, this one person on the court becomes this central figure in an administrative action. It is much less certain than congressional action. It's important and it's valuable, and we're glad the president's doing it. It's much less certain as a policy framework. So putting that to the side, I am not against it, but I think there's a reason that congressional action most people think is better. Congress has been tough on these issues. And again, I think a big part of that, I am one of those people who thinks that is not actually about real climate denial. I think what it's really about, if you dig under the surface, is that these individual senators are in fact reacting to, and House members, reacting to the people in their districts who are, A, giving them money, yes, but B, giving their people jobs. I mean, they're actually doing the work in that district. It's very hard to think about transitioning away from, think about Pennsylvania. Transitioning away from steel was a very long-term proposition. It started in the 70s and earlier. It's not over yet. Transitioning away from coal is a difficult proposition, especially because of the impact it's had on the land in coal states. Transitioning away from, look at North Dakota right now. It's a great example of what happens if you become dependent on a natural resource and the prices fluctuate. People are getting laid off every day in North Dakota right now. That might change. That's a very, very unstable economy, but it's also one that, that economy in North Dakota didn't literally exist before the Bakken Shale. It's an economy entirely dependent on the Bakken Shale. There's a reason that people are politically tied to these things. So I think it's a mistake also for us to sort of dismiss that, because these are real people with real jobs, and dismissing it actually loses you support for the work that we're all trying to do. So Congress has been tough, but there is in fact a comprehensive energy bill right now going through Congress, and I'm proud to say that it took 2 women in Congress to make this happen finally in a bipartisan way. Yay. Senators Murkowski and Cantwell. That's an energy bill that doesn't mention climate, and there's a reason for that. It does talk a bit about global climate impact research, but maybe that's okay because it does address some of the big issues Severin was talking about. It does talk about grid integration. It does talk about infrastructure investment, which is one of the key issues that we face in this country. As a developed country, we have existing infrastructure built for a different era of energy and transportation that is now being seen as unsustainable. So we have a very big challenge in developing countries, I'll talk about China in a bit, in building up things in the right way, but our challenge in this country is to rebuild everything in the right way with a government that doesn't believe in large-scale investment in infrastructure. So this bill, I think, is positive in that it does talk about infrastructure. It does talk about, some big baseload resources on the renewable side. Hydro, geothermal, and biomass are big parts of the bill. It's not a perfect bill at all, and it's been stalled right now, just in case you're not following it, because the Democrats actually stalled it because they wanted to include a big chunk of money for Flint. Michigan makes a lot of sense politically that they did that, but the bill's been stalled, so they're working through it now. But it actually has a fair amount of bipartisan support, so pay attention to that. At the state level, we have a 17-governor agreement on clean energy. You've probably seen this. It's bipartisan. It includes people who are fighting the Clean Power Plan. So Rick Snyder from Michigan is a signatory of the Clean Energy Agreement. At the same time, he's fighting the Clean Power Plan. That's because in Michigan, it makes economic sense to move toward more diversified energy system. There's 17 governors on that. No mention of climate. Again, Governor Brown's a signatory, as is the other Governor Brown, north of us. There's also, of course, scattered state and local actions, and just looking particularly at California, I just wanted to say, in addition to Severin's point, which I thought was very good about our leadership on technology, the fact that California's taken a leadership role on renewable energy and transportation and climate is leadership politically. We have become an example, both politically and technologically, of how this is possible. And I think that's actually very, very important to the larger conversation. That's why California is more than 1%, because it's actually creating a kind of a case study. So all of which is to say that I continue to think that we have to have strong congressional action to do anything about this, to change the game, to show U.S. leadership, to move toward a global solution. The U.S. and China are the two biggest emitters, the two biggest economies. We must have a solution in this country if we are going to move this global climate fight. Now, the question about that is, what's the pathway, what's the timing? And I'm sure we could have 1,000 conversations about that. I'm going to take a little step back to where I started and say I think we need to start not from where we wish we were, but where we are when we have that conversation. What is on the table today? What is the current political context? What is potentially possible? The good news is there's a couple things in our favor on this, and Severin again talked about some of these, so I'll talk about them a little more on the political side. Renewable energy prices actually are favorable for this conversation. You can no longer be stopped in your discussions about a price on carbon by people saying, but you're talking about an economy that's not possible. You're talking about technology that's not available or affordable. You're talking about an impossible pathway. Nobody can really say that anymore when it comes to renewables, because they're in a lot of places cheaper than coal and oil, depending on where you are. Bloomberg News just yesterday came out with a big article that you may have seen saying that the world is now adding more renewable energy capacity each year than coal, natural gas, and oil combined. That's a big change. I mean, that is a big, big change. And the reason that's so important is because where is new capacity being added? Mostly in developing countries, which are moving very fast. And again, going back to the earlier point, the key with developing countries is building the right way, because we don't want them to stop building, but building the right way and building with the right technologies. So that's good news. Caveat on that, to continue that trend, and the reason for that trend, billions need to be invested in research development, in storage, in new technologies, in technology scale, particularly in that period, the valley of death between pilot projects on technology and commercialization. Billions need to be invested and are being. That's why we're in this situation today. China, in particular, is investing billions. We are, in the private sector, investing billions in renewables. Another good thing in our favor, international competition. From a political standpoint, talking about other countries beating us is always good, So let me talk about China for a second. I'm now having done a lot of work at the local and state and national level in the U.S., I'm now finding myself having to become not actually an expert, but a semi-informed person on China. Working in China is really interesting. It's sort of like the fun mirror at a circus or something. It's like the polar opposite of working here. So you go to China and all of a sudden you have a national government that is committed to addressing carbon emissions and air quality and building up renewables as part of a comprehensive economic strategy. It's very strange. So you sort of like go there and they say, we want a new normal for the economy that's balanced, that has less manufacturing and more services, but that's also reducing fewer emissions and using more renewables. And you sort of think, wah. On the other hand, again, the fun mirror, they have an incredibly hard time doing that from the bottom up. Implementing those big goals, total disaster. I mean, it's incredibly disorganized. The Chinese political system we could talk about for an entire year, but it's very complicated because the mayors are all part of the Communist Party. So the mayors have their title as the mayor, but they also have a different title within the party. So for instance, the mayor of Beijing used to be, and they also move around. If they get promoted, if they do a good job as a mayor of one city, they get promoted to another city that's more strategically important. So you work with one mayor in one city for a year, and then all of a sudden, because he's really good, and then he gets promoted across China. It's very complicated. The current mayor of Beijing used to be the vice mayor of Shanghai and is a very high-level party person. The current mayor of Hebei, which is right next to Beijing, the largest steel-producing region of the world, is not particularly important in the party. So you go to a conference, and so the mayor of Beijing is at the front table, and like the vice mayor of Beijing is at the table, and the mayor of Hebei is like in the audience, and no one answers his questions. It's very strange, but so that's what you deal with when you deal with China. So it's very hard to do things from the bottom. On the other hand, China has committed to these things, has committed to peak emissions by 2030, and it looks like they'll do it well before that actually, to more than quadruple wind and solar development. As I said, they're also focused on shifting their overall economic model. This is all very good for us as in terms of competitiveness because we can talk about their commitments, and that's helpful from a U.S. political perspective. Once again, the caveat to make this happen, they are doing billions in government investment, particularly in research and development, but also in worker training, and also in industrial transformation. The third thing, and probably the most important to this room that we have on our side, is grassroots movement here in the U.S. And I just want to do shout out to CCL. You guys have been amazing. Everybody now talks about Citizens Climate Lobby when they talk about who's out there trying to get a price on carbon. It's really impressive what you've done. And I'm so glad funders are recognizing it, and it's really becoming part of you're able to scale up and bring on staff and really get bigger. The divestment movement, I also want to point to, has been really successful. I do a lot of conferences now because of risky business with sustainable investors. So I talk to investors a lot. I can't tell you the number of conferences I've been to in the last 2 years where endowment fund managers, where investment analysts, people who are not green people, are coming to me and saying, we are hearing from our board, we are hearing from our students, we are hearing from our funds that we have to diversify. We aren't going to go all the way to divestment, but we need to figure out diversification and reinvestment. How do we do that? And that has made a difference. So money is moving because of grassroots movement, which is fantastic. So the key question, I think, on the table, and I know I only have like 3 minutes, is with all this surround, can a price alone cause the shift in money and investment and markets that we need in the near term? And I think the answer to that has to be no. All of the things that Severin said, I agree with, so I'm not going to repeat them. But there's no question in my mind, watching this play out in other countries and here at the state level, that you need investment. You need investment. You need to invest in this shift, for the shift to happen in the next 5 to 10 years when we need it to happen. In developing countries, it has to happen now, or thousands and millions of buildings will be built that are not built well. Factories will be moved to places they should not go. Technologies will be invested in. Natural gas will be built up in a way it should not be built up. So in the short term, you have to move the market with investment and government action. It's just necessary. You see this happening with China and Germany, the two big examples of people moving fast on this. What are they investing in? Infrastructure. worker transition out of these industries, R&D in a major way, education and training. We are doing some private sector investment on the R&D side, but we're not doing nearly enough on anything else. So government, I think the key here is government plays a vital role in this conversation. Change in price alone and the market alone just can't make the difference that we need. And so while price is key, this is my big place where I would probably say, I love what you're doing. I worry about the dividend piece, because ultimately we have to invest. There has to be a piece of those funds that goes back into transition to make this work for the people who currently have these jobs, for the politicians who respond to the people who currently have these jobs. We have to figure out a way to train them for the next set of jobs that we know are coming, but that are completely different skills and completely different types of backgrounds to the jobs people have now. We need money to invest in R&D. I really agree with Severin on this. It's the key thing. Some of the big questions out there, storage is the biggest. We must solve that to get where we want to go. If you've read Mark Jacobson's work on 100% renewables underlying the Solutions Project, if you read into that work, it depends on massive technology investment and government and infrastructure investment. We need to rebuild our infrastructure in this country if any of this stuff is going to move. If any of these electric cars are going to go anywhere, if any of these grids are going to integrate renewables, if any of this stuff is going to work, if we're going to be prepared for climate change and climate impacts, we must rebuild our infrastructure. We have never done that in the world without major government investment. There's no incentive for businesses to do that kind of investment over a 50, 100-year time frame. So I guess my call here would be, the price is key. It's key. It's the most important thing. It's not the only thing. Investment is critical, and this will not work in the short term without it. And I would just say, I think we need you. We need a comprehensive strategy, but it needs to be starting where we are now and with what we actually need to do, and not with where we wish we were in the future. And I'll end there.
Thank you.